Four American naval heroes, the story of Paul Jones. First chapter, The Little Scotch Lad. Many years ago, there lived in the southwestern part of Scotland, on the beautiful bay called Solway Firth, a gentleman whose name was Mr. Crack. In Scotland, a large farm is called an estate, and Mr. Crack named his estate Arbigland. His large house stood high on the shore overlooking the sea. The lawn sloped gradually to the firth. Mr. Crack's gardener, Paul Jones, or should I say John Paul, lived in a cottage on the estate. Mr. Crack was very fond of John Paul, for he worked well. He made the grounds like a beautiful park and planted many trees, some of which are still standing. One day, John Paul married Jean Macduff. She was the daughter of a neighboring farmer. She and John lived very happily in their estate cottage. They had 7 children. The 5th child was a boy named for his father, John Paul. He was born July 6, 1747. When little John was large enough to run about, he liked to play on the beautiful lawn and to wander along the shore of the firth. Sometimes he would sit still for hours watching the waves. Sometimes he and Mr. Crack's little boy would play with tiny sailboats and paddle about in the water. When they grew tired of this, they would climb among the rocks on the mountains, which were back of the estate. When there were storms at sea, vessels would come to Solway Firth for safe harbor. The water was very deep near the shore. Because of this, the ships could come so near the lawn of the Arbigland that their masts seemed to touch the overhanging trees. Little John Paul and his playmates liked to watch the sailors and sometimes could even talk to them. They heard many wonderful stories of a land called America, where grew the tobacco that was packed in some of the ships. The children would often take their little sailboats to some inlet where they would play sailor. John Paul was always the captain. He had listened carefully to the commands given by the captain of the large vessels. These he would repeatedly correct, and with great dignity, though he did not always understand them. John Paul spent more time in this kind of play than going to school. In those days, there were few schools, and book learning was not thought to be of much use. At a parish school nearby, John learned to spell and to repeat the rules of grammar. When he was 12 years old, he felt that the time had come when he could be a real sailor. So his father allowed him to go across the firth to an English town called Whitehaven. There he was apprenticed to Mr. Younger, a merchant who owned a ship and traded in goods brought in foreign lands. He soon went to sea in Mr. Younger's vessel, the Friendship. This ship was bound for America to get tobacco from the Virginia fields. Chapter 2, The Young Sailor. At that time, the trip across the Atlantic could not be made as quickly as now. There were no steamships, and the sailing vessels had, of course, to depend upon the wind to carry them to their destination. It was several months before the Friendship anchored at the mouth at the Rappahannock River. Farther inland and on this river was the town of Fredericksburg. John Paul's eldest brother, William, lived there. He had left his Scottish home many years before and had come with his wife to Virginia. Here he was now living on his own plantation, where he raised tobacco for the English market. While the Friendship was in port being loaded for its return voyage, John Paul went to Fredericksburg to stay with his brother. While there, he spent the most of his time in hard study, and although he was still young, he had found that he could not succeed as he wished with so little education. It was during these months in America that he formed the habit of study. All through the remainder of his life, his leisure time was given to the reading of books. After he returned to Scotland, he spent 6 years in the employ of Mr. Younger. During that time, he learned a great deal about good seamanship. When John Paul was 19 years of age, the loss of money compelled Mr. Younger to give up his business. John Paul was soon afterwards made mate on the slaver called the Two Friends. This was a vessel whose sole business was the carrying of slaves from Africa to America and then to other countries. People at the time did not think there was anything wrong in slave trading. It was very profitable business. Even the sailors made more money than did those on vessels engaged in other businesses. The ship Two Friends carried a cargo of slaves to Jamaica, an English possession in the West Indies. As soon as port was reached, John Paul left the vessel. He said that he would never again sail on a slave trading voyage. He could not endure to see men and women treated so cruelly and bought and sold like cattle. He sailed for home as a passenger on board a small trading vessel. On the voyage, both the captain and the mate died of fever, and the ship with all of its passengers was in mid-ocean with no one to command. John Paul took the captain's place, for no one else knew so much about seamanship. This was a daring thing for one so young, as he was not yet 20 years old. When he brought the vessel safely into port, the owners were so grateful to him that they made him the captain. Soon afterwards, he sailed for the West Indies. The carpenter on board was one day very disrespectful to the young captain. He was punished by a flogging and was discharged. Not long after this, he died of a fever. The enemies of John Paul were so jealous of him, thought this was their chance to do him harm. They said that the flogging had killed the carpenter. Many people believed this, and when John Paul again returned to Scotland, he found that his friends had lost their faith in him. And during the next 2 years, he made several voyages, but all the while he remembered the injustices done to him. He finally succeeded, however, in proving his friendship that he was worthy of their confidence. When John Paul visited his brother in Virginia, America was not much like it is now. Most of the country was an unexplored wilderness, and there was no United States as we call it today. Some large settlements known as colonies had been made in that part of the country which lies between the Atlantic Ocean and the Allegheny Mountains. Most of the people who lived in these colonies were English, and their governors were appointed by the King of England. Now, each governor, with the help of a few men whom he chose from the people, would make laws for their colony. Not all the laws were made in this way. Sometimes the king, without caring for the wishes of the colonists, would make laws to suit himself. Up to this time, the people had been obedient and loyal to their king. But when George III came to the throne of England, he caused the people a great deal of trouble. He sent orders to the governors that the colonists should trade with no other country than his own, period. All their goods should be bought in England, and to pay for them, they must send to the same country all their corn, cotton, and tobacco, which they had to sell. Now, the colonists wished to build factories and weave their own cloth, but the king would not allow this. And for a long time, while England had been at war with France, King George said that the colonists should help pay for these war expenses, and therefore he began to tax the colonists very heavily. They were obliged to pay a tax on every pound of tea that came into port in America, and stamped paper must be bought for every legal document from England. The colonists were very much aroused on account of this tea tax and the Stamp Act, as it was called. One day, Startling news came that One day, startling news came to John Paul in Virginia. A shipload of tea had anchored in the Boston harbor. The colonists declared that they would not pay the tax on this tea, and some of them, dressed as Indians, had gone on board the vessel and thrown it all into the harbor. Later on came the news that the king had sent his English soldiers to Boston to keep those people quiet. He had also closed the port of Boston and said that no more ships should come in or out. Well, this aroused the whole country. Everybody felt that something must be done to preserve the freedom of the people. Each colony chose men as delegates to confer together about what was best to be done. The delegates met in Philadelphia on the 5th of September, 1774. That meeting has since been called the First Continental Congress of America. The delegates of the colonies decided to send a petition to the king just asking that he would remove the taxes and not make any more unjust laws. All winter, the people waited for that answer, but none came, and in fact, matters grew worse in the spring. On the 19th of April, 1775, a battle was fought with the king's soldiers at Lexington in Massachusetts. This was the first battle of the American Revolution. Chapter 4. In the year 1773, soon after the trouble with England had begun, John Paul's brother, William, died in Virginia. He left some money in his plantation, but had made no will to say who should have those things. He had no children, and his wife had been dead for years. His father had died the year before, and John was the only one of the family now living who could manage the estate. So he left the sea and went to live on the farm near Fredericksburg in Virginia. He thought that he would spend the rest of his life just in this quiet country. He would never return to the sea. He soon learned to love America very deeply, even more than he did his own country. He wanted to see the colonists win in their struggle for their rights. But so good a sailor could not be a good farmer. In 2 years, the farm was in bad condition, and all the money left by his brother had been spent. The agents in Scotland, with whom John Paul had left money for the care of his mother and sisters, had proved to be dishonest, and this money also had been lost. In the midst of these perplexities, he decided to serve America in the war, which everyone saw was now inevitable. Another Congress of delegates from the colonies met in 1775 and made preparations for that war. The colonists were organized into an army with George Washington as the commander-in-chief. A fleet of English vessels had been sent across the Atlantic. The swiftest of these sailed up and down the Atlantic coast, forcing the people in towns to give provisions to the king's sailors and soldiers. Other vessels were constantly coming over, loaded with arms and ammunition for the English soldier. George Washington's army was almost without ammunition. There was very little gunpowder made in this country at that time, and the need of it at this time was very great. It was thought that the best way to supply the American army with ammunition was just to go out and capture one of those English vessels. It was for this purpose that the first American Navy was organized. The first Navy Yard was established at Plymouth. Here, a few schooners and merchant vessels were equipped with cannon as warships. These were manned by bold, brave men who since boyhood had been on the sea in fishing or trading vessels. No member of the Continental Congress did more to strengthen and enlarge this first Navy than John Adams. In 1775, John Paul settled up his affairs left the Virginia farm and went to Philadelphia to offer his services to the Naval Committee of Congress. He gave his name as John Paul Jones. Just why did he do this? We don't know. Perhaps he did not wish his friends in Scotland to know that he had taken up arms against his native country. Perhaps he thought that should he ever be captured by the English, it would go harder with him if they should know his English name. We cannot tell. Hereafter we shall call him Paul Jones, as this was the name by which he was known during the rest of his life. Congress accepted his offer, and he made first lieutenant on the Alfred, a flagship. Chapter 5. The young lieutenant was now 29 years old. His health was excellent, and he could endure great fatigue. His figure was light, graceful, and active. His face was stern, and his manner was soldiery. He was a fine seaman and familiar with armed vessels. He knew that the men placed above him in the Navy had had less experience than he, but he took the position given him without complaint. When the commander of the Alfred came on board, Paul Jones hoisted the American flag. This was the first time a flag of our own had ever been raised. We do not know just what this flag was like, but some of the earliest naval flags bore the picture of a lone pine tree. Others had a rattlesnake stretched across the stripes and the words, "Don't tread on me." Our present flag was not adopted until 2 years later. On the 17th of February, 1776, the first American squadron sailed for the Bahama Islands. On the way, 2 British sloops were captured. The English sailors told the Americans that on the island of New Providence were forts which contained a large amount of military supplies. They said these forts could easily be taken. The soldiers on a vessel are called Marines. A plan was made to hide the American Marines in the British sloops. In that way, it was thought that they could go safely into the harbor of New Providence. Then they could land and take possession of the forts. This plan would have been successful, but for one foolish mistake. The squadron sailed so close to the harbor during the night that in the morning all the ships could be seen from the shore. The war vessels should have remained out of sight until the Marines had been safely landed from the sloops. The alarm was spread and the sloops were not allowed to cross the bar. The commander of the squadron then planned to land on the opposite side of the island and take the forts from the rear. But Paul Jones told him he could not do this. There was no place to anchor the squadron and no road to the forts. However, he had learned from the pilots of the good landing not far from the harbor. He had learned from the pilots of a good landing not far from the harbor. When he told the commander of this, he was only rebuked for confiding in pilots. So Paul Jones undertook alone to conduct Alfred to the landing he had found. He succeeded in doing this, and the whole squadron afterwards followed. The English soldiers abandoned the forts, and the squadron sailed away the same day, carrying 100 cannon and other military stores. Chapter 6. A short time after this, the American squadron tried to capture a British ship called the Glasgow, but the attempt was not successful. Because of this failure, one of the captains was dismissed from the Navy, and the command of his vessel was given to Lieutenant Jones. This vessel was named the Providence. With it and the Alfred, which he also commanded, Captain Jones captured 16 prizes in 6 weeks. Among them were cargoes of coal and dry goods. Best of all, he captured an English vessel bound for Canada full of warm clothing for the British soldiers. This was a prize that proved of great value to General Washington's poorly clothed army. In those days, there were selfish people just as now, and in January 1777, a jealous commodore succeeded in depriving Paul Jones of his position as captain. He was now without ship or rank, and when he appealed to Congress, he was put off with promises from time to time. It was not until May that his petition was heard. There were 3 new ships being built for the Navy at Boston. Congress gave him permission to choose one of these and have it fitted out as he wished. While waiting in Boston for these ships to be finished, Paul Jones wrote many wise suggestions about the management of the Navy. Congress at first paid little attention to these suggestions, but afterwards glad to act upon them. Here are some of the things he said. 1. Every officer should be examined before he receives his commission. 2. The ranks in the Navy should correspond to those in the Army. 3. As England has the best Navy in the world, we should copy hers. Before the ships he had chosen was completed, he was ordered to wait no longer in Boston, but to take the Ranger, an old vessel, and sail at once for France. Through the efforts of Benjamin Franklin, the American minister to France, the French king had acknowledged the independence of the colonies and was ready to aid the Americans in the war. Paul Jones was to carry a letter from Congress to the American commissioner in Paris. This letter told the commissioner to buy a new fast-sailing frigate for Captain Jones and to have it fitted up as he desired. They were then to advise him as to what he should do with it. Chapter 7. When the Ranger sailed out of Boston Harbor, the stars and stripes of the American Republic waved from the masthead. Paul Jones was the first naval officer to raise this flag. You remember that 2 years before on the Alfred, he had also hoisted the pine tree emblem flag. When Jones with his ship entered Quiberon Bay in France, the French admiral there saluted the American flag. This was the first time that a foreign country had recognized America as an independent nation. Paul Jones anchored the Ranger at Brest and went to Paris to deliver his letter and lay his plans before the commissioners. He told them 2 important things. First, that our Navy was too small to win in open battle with the fleets of the English. And second, that the way to keep the English vessels from burning, destroying, and carrying away property on the American coast was to send vessels to the English coast to annoy the English in the same way. The commissioners thought that these plans should be carried out at once, and since a new frigate could not be purchased for some time, they refitted the Ranger for his use. On April 10, 1778, Paul Jones set out on what proved to be a memorable cruise. You remember that when he first went to sea as a boy, he sailed from Whitehaven? This town is on the English coast, just across the Solway Firth from John Paul's old home. He knew there were large shipping yards there, and he determined to set fire to them. He planned to reach the harbor in the night and burn the ships while the people were asleep. Because of the wind and tides, it was nearly midnight before he arrived. He found 300 vessels of different kinds lying in the harbor. His men were put into two small boats, and each boat was ordered to set fire to half the ships. It was nearly daylight when they rowed away from the Ranger. Nothing could be heard but the splashing of their oars. Their flickering torches showed to them the old sleeping town with the many white ships along the shore. Leaving orders that the fire be speedily kindled, Captain Jones took with him a few men and scaled the walls of the batteries which protected the harbor. He locked the sleeping sentinels in the guardhouse and spiked the cannon. Then, sending his men back to the harbor, he went with one man only to another fort, which was a quarter of a mile away. Here he also spiked the guns. After all this had been done, he returned to his boats to find that his sailors had done nothing. Not one ship was on fire. The lieutenant in charge told Paul Jones that their torches had gone out. Anyway, he said, nothing can be gained by burning poor people's property. Determined that they should not leave the harbor until something was destroyed, Paul Jones ran to a neighboring house and got a light. With this, he set fire to the largest ship. By this time, the people had been aroused and hundreds were running to the shore. There was no time to do more. The sailors hastened back to the Ranger, taking with them 3 prisoners whom Paul Jones said he would show as samples. The soldiers tried to shoot the sailors from the forts, but they could do nothing with the spiked guns. The sailors amused themselves by firing back pistol shots. On reaching the ship, they found that a man was missing. Paul Jones was afraid that harm had befallen him. He need not have been troubled, however, for the man was just a deserter. He spread the alarm for miles along the shore. The people afterwards called him the savior of Whitehaven. Paul Jones was greatly disappointed by the failure of his plans. He knew that if he had reached the harbor a few hours earlier, he could have burned not only all the ships, but the entire town. Although the plan to destroy English property to aid the American cause was a wise one from a military point of view, yet we cannot understand why Paul Jones should have selected Whitehaven for this destruction. There he had received kindness and employment when a boy. His mother and sisters lived just across the bay, and had he succeeded in burning Whitehaven, the people in their anger might have injured the family of the man who had so cruelly harmed them. We wonder if he thought of these things. The Earl of Selkirk lived near Whitehaven on St. Mary's Isle. As the Ranger sailed by this island, Paul Jones thought it would be well to take the Earl prisoner. There were many Americans held as prisoners by the English, and the Earl could be exchanged for some of these. So with a few men, Paul Jones rowed to the shore where some fishermen told him that the Earl was away from home. Paul Jones started to go back to his vessel, but his sailors were disappointed and asked his permission to go to the Earl's house and take away the silver. Paul Jones did not like this plan, but at last consented. He did not go with the men, however. He walked up and down the shore until they returned. The sailors found Lady Selkirk and her family at breakfast. They took all the silver from the table, put it into a bag, and returned to the ship. Paul Jones was always troubled about this afterwards. He afterwards bought the silver for a large sum of money and sent it back to Lady Selkirk with a letter of apology. The people in the neighborhood were frightened when they heard of the Earl's silver being taken. They ran here and there, hiding their valuables. Some of them dragged a cannon to the shore and spent a night firing at what they supposed in the darkness to be Paul Jones' vessel. In the morning they found they had wasted all their powder on a rock. The next day the alarm was carried to all the towns along the shore. Beware of Paul Jones, the pirate! Chapter 8. An English naval vessel called the Drake was sent out to capture the Ranger. Everyone felt sure that she would be successful, and 5 boatloads of men went out with her to see the fight. When the Drake came alongside of the Ranger, she hailed and asked what ship it was. Paul Jones replied, "The American continental ship Ranger. Come on, we're waiting for you." After a battle of 1 hour, the Drake surrendered. The captain and 42 men had been killed, and the vessel was badly injured. Paul Jones lost only his lieutenant and 1 seaman. 6 others were wounded, 1 whom died. This was a great victory for Paul Jones. The Drake not only mounted 2 more guns than the Ranger, but was manned by a crew that was much better drilled. The vessel belonged to the established English Navy, which was accustomed to victory at sea. Towing the Drake, Paul Jones sailed northward in safety. Then, leaving the Irish Sea, he sailed around the north coast of Ireland and returned to the harbor at Brest with the Drake and 200 prisoners. This was just a month from the day he had set out on his cruise. The French government had now concluded an alliance with the American Republic. War had been openly declared between France and England, and all the French people rejoiced over the victory of the Ranger. Paul Jones was not sorry when Congress sent him an order to bring his vessel to America. It was needed to protect the coast of New Jersey from the warships of the British. Paul Jones was not sorry when Congress the French king did not like brave Paul Jones to return to America. He wished him to remain where he could be of more direct service to France. He therefore caused letters to be sent to him, promising that if he would just stay on that side of the Atlantic, he should have command of the new frigate he had wished for so long. Pleased with the prospect of this, he gave up the command of the Ranger, and it sailed to America under a new captain. But promises are often more easily made than kept. The French Navy was not very well supplied with ships and officers. These officers were jealous of the success of Paul Jones and did all they could to prevent him from obtaining his commission. The summer and most of the winter of 1778 passed away, and Paul Jones was still waiting for his ship. He began to wish that he had gone to America. Some wealthy men offered him a ship if he would take charge of a trading expedition for him. To do this, he would need to give up his commission in the American Navy, and so Paul Jones said, "As a servant of the Republic of America, I cannot serve either myself or my best friends unless the honor of America is the first object." During these months of waiting, his only weapon was his pen. He wrote letters of appeal to all persons of influence, to Congress, and also to the King of France. Chapter 9. One day when Paul Jones was reading Poor Richard's Almanac, written by Dr. Franklin, he found a paragraph which set him thinking. It was, "If you would have your business done, go. If not, send." He sent no more letters, but went at once to the French court and pleaded his case there in person. As a result, he was soon after made commander of a vessel which he named the Bonhomme Richard, which means Poor Richard. He did this out of gratitude to Dr. Franklin. The Bonhomme Richard was an old trading vessel, poorly fitted for war. But after his long months of waiting, Paul Jones was thankful even for this. He was also given command of 4 smaller vessels. One of these, the Alliance, it had for captain a Frenchman named Pierre Landias, who was afterwards the cause of much trouble. Paul Jones was ordered to cruise with his small squadron along the west coast of Ireland and to capture all the English merchant vessels he could find. The officer next in command to Paul Jones was Lieutenant Richard Dale, who had since been remembered not only for his bravery during that famous cruise, but for his service to the country at a later period. On August 14th, 1779, the ships put to sea. When they reached the southern point of Ireland, one of the 4 vessels left behind and deserted. Well, cruising northward, the squadron soon captured 2 valuable prizes. Without asking the permission of Paul Jones, Captain Landias sent these captured vessels to Norway. On the way, they were taken by the Danes, who then returned them to England. The value of these prizes thus lost through Captain Landias was about £40,000 or nearly $200,000. The squadron sailed around the north of Scotland and down the eastern coast until it came to the Firth of Forth. Here was the town of Leith, and in its harbor lay some English war vessels. Paul Jones wished to capture these. The winds were favorable, and a landing could easily have been made for Captain Landias. Paul Jones spent a whole night persuading this troublesome captain to help him. It was only with the promise of money that he at last succeeded, but in the morning the winds were contrary. That day the Richard captured an English merchant ship. The captain promised Paul Jones that if he would allow his vessel to go free, he would pilot the squadron into the harbor. The people, seeing the fleet piloted by the English vessel, supposed the visit to be friendly. So they sent a boat out to the Richard asking for powder and shot to defend the town from the visit of Paul Jones the pirate. Jones sent back a barrel of powder with the message that he had no suitable shot. It was not until the vessels were nearing the harbor that the object of the visit was suspected. The people, in their fright, ran to the house of the minister. He had helped them when in trouble at other times and could surely do something now. The good man with his flock following him ran to the beach where he made a strange prayer. He told the Lord that the people there were very poor and that the wind was bringing to the shore that vile pirate, Paul Jones, who would burn their houses and take away even their clothes. I cannot think of it. I have long been of faith, servant to ye, O Lord. But gin ye dinna turn the wind aboot to blaw the scoundrel out of the gates, I'll nail Sir a foot, but we'll sit here till the tide comes in. Well, just then a violent gale sprung up, and by the time it had abated, the squadron had been driven so far out to sea that the plan was given up. Long afterwards, the good minister would often say, I prayed, but the Lord sent the wind. Chapter 10. Paul Jones next cruised up and down the eastern coast of England, trying to capture some merchant ship that were bound for London. About noon on September 23rd, 1779, he was not far from the shore. He saw, not far from the shore, an English fleet sailing from the north. It was convoyed by two new warships, the Serapis and the Countess of Scarborough. Paul Jones at once signaled to his ship to form a line of battle. Captain Landius, of course, disobeyed. The sight of the American squadron seemed to cause confusion in the English fleet. They let fly their top gallant sails and fired many signals. The Serapis and the Countess drew up in a line of battle and waited for the enemy while the merchant ships ran into port. It was a clear, calm afternoon. The sea was like a polished mirror with scarcely a ripple on its surface. The vessels approached each other so slowly that they scarcely seemed to move. The decks had all been cleared for action, and the captains were full of impatience. Word had gone from town to town along the shore that a great battle was soon to be fought. The people along the shore gathered on the high cliffs, eagerly hoping to see the dreaded Paul Jones crushed forever. The sun had gone down behind the hills before the ships were within speaking distance of each other. The harvest moon came up full and clear and shed a soft light over the dreadful battle that followed. Captain Landius, when he disobeyed Paul Jones's order to join in line of battle, spread the sails of the Alliance and went quickly towards the enemy as though he were going to make an attack. But when very near to where the Serapis lay, he changed his course and sailed away to a place where the battle could be seen without harm. About 7:30 in the evening, the Richard rounded to on the side of the Serapis within pistol shot. Captain Pearson of the Serapis hailed, saying, "What ship is that?" The answer came, "I can't hear what you say." Captain Pearson repeated, "What ship is that?" "Answer at once, or I shall fire." Paul Jones replied with a shot. This was followed by a broadside from each vessel. At this first fire, two of the guns in the lower battery of the Richard burst. The explosion tore up the decks and killed many men. The two vessels now began pouring broadsides into each other. The Richard was so old and rotten, and these shots caused her to leak badly. Captain Pearson saw this and hailed, saying, "Has your ship struck?" And the bold reply came, "I have not yet begun to fight." Paul Jones saw that as the Serapis was so much the better ship of the two, his only hope lay in getting the vessels so close together that the men could board the Serapis from the Richard. All this time the vessels had been sailing in the same direction, crossing and recrossing each other's course. Finally, Paul Jones ran the Richard across the bow of the Serapis. The anchor of the Serapis caught in the stern of the Richard and became firmly fastened there. As the vessels were swung around by the tide, the sides came together. The spars and rigging were entangled and remained so until the close of the engagement. With the muzzles of the guns almost touching, the firing began. The effect was terrible. Paul Jones, who had only two guns that could be used on the starboard side, grappled with the Serapis. With the help of a few men, he brought over a larboard gun, and these three were all that he used during the rest of the battle. Meanwhile, the other ships of the American squadron did strange things. The Pallas, which is the name of a boat, so the Pallas alone did her duty. In a half an hour, she had captured the Countess of Scarborough. The Vengeance simply sailed for the nearest harbor. Worst of all was the conduct of Captain Landius and his ship Alliance. For a while he looked quietly on, as though he were umpire. At 9:30 o'clock he came along the larboard side of the Richard, so that she was between him and the enemy. Then he deliberately fired into her, killing many men. Many voices cried out that he was firing into the wrong ship. He seemed to not hear them, for until the battle was over, his firing continued. The poor Richard had an enemy now on both sides. Paul Jones sent some men up the mast and into the rigging to throw hand grenades or bombs among the enemy. One of these set fire to some cartridges on the deck of the Serapis. This caused a terrible explosion, disabling all the men at the guns in that part of the ship. 20 of them were killed outright. By this time, not much water had leaked into the Richard that she was settling. I'm going to say that again. By this time, so much water had leaked into the Richard that she was settling. A sailor, seeing this, set up the cry, "Quarter! Quarter! Our ship is sinking!" Captain Pearson, hearing the cry, sent his men to board the Richard. Paul Jones, with a pike in his hand, headed a party of his men similarly armed and drove the English back. Some of the Richard's men ran below and set the prisoners free. There were more than 100 of them. One of these prisoners climbed through the portholes into the Serapis. He told Captain Pearson that if he would hold out a little longer, the Richard would either sink or strike. Poor Paul Jones was now in a hard place. His ship was sinking. More than 100 prisoners were running about the decks, and they, with the crew, were shouting for quarter. His own ship, the Alliance, was hurling shots at him from the other side. Everywhere was confusion, but he alone was undismayed. He shouted to the prisoners, "Just go back to below and start pumping, and they would quickly be drowned." He ordered the crew to their places. He himself never left the 3 guns that could still be fired. At 10:30 o'clock, the Serapis surrendered. When Captain Pearson gave his sword to Paul Jones, he said it was very hard to surrender to a man who had fought, quote, "with a halter round his neck," unquote. Paul Jones replied, "Sir, you have fought like a hero. I hope your king will reward you." This battle had lasted for 3.5 hours. It had since been known in history as one of the greatest victories ever won upon the seas. The Serapis and the Countess were both new ships, one of 40 guns and the other of 20. The crews were well-drilled Englishmen. Everything was against the Richard, and the victory was due alone to the great courage and will of its commander. When the fight was over, Paul Jones separated the ships and set the sails of the Richard. All night, every sailor was busy fighting the fire which raged on both ships. When daylight showed to Captain Pearson the wreck of the Richard, he was sorry he had surrendered. Her rudder was gone, and her rotten timbers were split into pieces. Some of the shots had passed entirely through her. Paul Jones wished to take her into port to show how desperately he had fought, but this was out of the question. By 9 o'clock, the sailors abandoned her, and at 10, she suddenly went down. Repairing the Serapis as best he could, Paul Jones took her and the Countess of Scarborough with his unfaithful fleet to Holland. Chapter 11. After this great victory, Paul Jones was everywhere received as a hero. The King of France presented him with a gold sword. He also sent word through his minister that, with the consent of Congress, he would make Paul Jones a Knight of the Order of Military Merit. To avoid delay, the gold cross of the order had been sent to the French minister in America, who would present it to Paul Jones when permission to accept it had been received by Congress. The hero traveled about in Holland and France from city to city, enjoying his great triumph. Crowds of people were everywhere, eager to see him, and a word with him was thought to be a great honor. The most serious fault in the character of Paul Jones was his vanity. He had always been very fond of praise and glory, and now his longings were partly satisfied by all this homage. Dr. Franklin wrote him a letter praising him for his bravery. He thanked him most of all for the prisoners he had captured. There were so many of them that by exchange every American held by the English could be set at liberty. While Paul Jones was enjoying this praise, Captain Landius was going also about claiming for himself the glory for the capture of the Serapis and trying to make people believe that he was the real hero. When Dr. Franklin heard from the sailors how he had fired upon the Richard, he ordered him to Paris to be tried in court. During the next year, Paul Jones made a few short cruises, but accomplished nothing more than taking of a few prizes. At this time, the army of George Washington was sorely in need of clothing and military supplies. Word was sent to Dr. Franklin to buy them in France and send them to America by Paul Jones. 15,000 muskets with powder and 120 bales of cloth were bought and sold in the Alliance and the Ariel. They were bought and stored in the Alliance and the Ariel, both of those being ships. Dr. Franklin told Paul Jones to sail with these goods at once. This was early in the year of 1780. The summer came and passed away, and the ships were still anchored in the French harbor. Paul Jones gave excuse after excuse until the patience of Dr. Franklin was about gone. Captain Landius had been one cause of the delay. Instead of going to Paris for trial, as Franklin had ordered, he had gone back to the Alliance to stir up mutiny against Paul Jones. He caused one trouble after another and disobeyed every order. Finally, by intrigue, he took command of the Alliance and sailed to America. But Captain Landius never again troubled Paul Jones. His reception in America was not what he expected. I'm going to stop the story right now. I'm assuming that it was Paul Jones that finally, by intrigue, he took command of the Alliance and sailed to America. We shall see. Was it him or was... Okay. But Captain Landius never again troubled Paul Jones. His reception in America was not what he had expected. Instead of being regarded as a hero, he was judged insane and dismissed from the Navy. A small share of prize money was afterward paid to him, and on this he lived until 87 years of age when he died in Brooklyn. Okay, friends, we can surmise that instead of Paul Jones taking those things back to George Washington, the 120 bales of cloth and the cloth and some muskets and powder, it was Captain Landius who by intrigue, took command of the alliance. And he is the one who eventually, at age 87, died in Brooklyn, New York. All right, on to this. Another reason Paul Jones gave for his delay in France was that he wished to get the prize money due to him for the capture of the Serapis, and he wanted to pay those sailors. This gave him an excuse to linger about the courts where he could receive more of the homage he loved so well. Then, too, he spent much time in getting letters and certificates of his bravery from the king and the ministers. He wished to show these to Congress when he should arrive in America. Finally, one day in October, he set sail in the Ariel. He had not gone far when a furious gale forced him to return to port for safety. For 3 months longer he waited, hoping still for the prize money that was due. One day he gave a grand fete on his ship. Flags floated from every mast. Pink silk curtains hung from awnings on the deck. These were decorated with mirrors, pictures, and flowers. The company invited were men and women of high rank. When all was ready, Paul Jones sent his boat ashore to bring them on board. He himself, dressed in full uniform, received them and conducted them to their seats on the deck. At 3 o'clock, they sat down to an elaborate dinner, which lasted until sunset. At 8 o'clock, as the moon rose, a mock battle of the Richard and the Serapis was given. There was much noise from the firing of guns and a great blaze of light from the rockets that were sent up. The effect was beautiful, but the din was such that the ladies were frightened. At the end of an hour, this display was ended. After a dance on the deck, the officers rowed the company back to shore. So on the 18th of December, 1780, nearly a year after he had received his orders, Jones sailed for America. He arrived in Philadelphia on February 18th, 1781. When Congress inquired into the cause of his long delay, he gave explanations which seemed to be satisfactory. Resolution of thanks were passed and permission given to the French minister to present the Cross of Military Merit, which had been sent by the French king. This cross was presented with great ceremony, and it was ever after a source of much pride to Paul Jones, and he wore it upon all occasions and loved to be called, it's a French word, is it chevalier? During the following year, Paul Jones superintended the construction of a new warship, the America, which was being built by Congress. This was the largest 74-gun ship in the world, and he was going to be her captain. Once more, Paul Jones was disappointed. Before the America was finished, Congress decided to give her to France. She was to replace a French vessel, which had been lost while in American service. Paul Jones was again without a ship, and he could not bear to be idle. He spent the time until the close of the war with the French fleet, cruising among the West Indies. As soon as he heard that peace was declared between England and America, he left the French fleet and returned to America, and he arrived in Philadelphia in 1783. Now that the war was over and there was no more fighting to be done, Paul Jones thought that the best thing for him to do was just to get that prize money still due from the French government for the vessels he had captured. For this purpose, he soon returned to France. After many delays, the money amounted to nearly $30,000, and that was paid to him. It was to be divided among the officers and the crew of the ship which he commanded. Paul Jones came again to America in 1787 to attend the final division of his money. And while in this country, Congress ordered a gold medal to be presented to him for his services in the war. Well, I am going to stop there. I hope you enjoyed that story about John Paul Jones, a naval hero for sure. We'll talk to you next time.